In the heart of a war-torn kingdom, a quiet, unassuming farmer named Jethro lives a solitary life, far removed from the bloodshed and chaos that plagues the land. But when a group of ruthless outlaws arrive at his farm, intent on robbing him and intimidating him into submission, they have no idea that Jethro is not just any farmer. Once the kingdom's most feared swordsman, he had chosen a life of peace, leaving his past behind. But now, as danger draws near, his past skills will be tested once more, and the outlaws will discover that they've crossed the wrong man. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the rolling fields surrounding Jethro's small farm. The air was thick with the scent of fresh earth and growing crops, a peaceful silence hanging over the land. To any passerby, Jethro's life seemed simple and unremarkable. A man who worked the land, tending to his crops and animals with the quiet diligence of one who had known nothing else. But beneath this calm exterior lay a history few could imagine. Once, Jethro had been known across the kingdom for his deadly skill with a sword. His name had struck fear into the hearts of men, both noble and outlaw alike. He had fought for kings, battled in great wars, and ended countless lives with the precision of a master swordsman. But all that had ended long ago. After the war, after the bloodshed, Jethro had abandoned the life of a warrior and sought solace in the quiet solitude of farming. Now, years had passed since he had laid down his sword. Jethro had built a modest life for himself on the farm, far from the violence of the world. His days were spent working the soil, caring for his animals, and maintaining the peace he had fought so hard to find. There was no room for conflict in his life anymore. There was no room for the past. But peace, it seemed, was something that could never last. It was on one of those quiet evenings, as the shadows lengthened and the chirping of crickets filled the air, that the peace of Jethro's farm was shattered. The first sign of trouble came as Jethro was finishing up his evening chores. He had just finished feeding the livestock when he heard the sound of horses approaching from the road. His instincts, honed from years of vigilance during his time as a soldier, immediately went on alert. It wasn't the first time someone had come to his farm. Travelers occasionally passed through, looking for a place to rest, but there was something different about this group. The sound of horses grew louder, and soon Jethro could see the figures on horseback cresting the hill. They were a rough-looking band, 3 men, all wearing dark, worn clothing, their faces hidden beneath hoods and scarves. They didn't look like travelers. They looked like trouble. Jethro stood still, watching them approach, his hand resting on the handle of the pitchfork he had been using to clean the stables. He could feel his pulse quicken, the familiar feeling of danger rising in his chest. He hadn't fought in years, but the instinct to protect what was his, the farm, the life he had built, was something that ran deep within him. The men halted in front of the farm's gate, dismounting with the casual arrogance of those who felt they were in control. Jethro didn't move. He simply watched them, his eyes cold and calculating. One of the men, the tallest of the group, stepped forward. His eyes scanned the small farm, taking in the crops, the animals, and then, finally, Jethro himself. A sneer twisted the man's lips. "Well, well," the leader said, his voice thick with mockery. "What have we here? A farmer, all alone in this patch of nothing. Looks like an easy mark, boys." The 2 other men laughed, their voices low and menacing, as they circled the farm. Jethro remained motionless, his gaze locked on the leader. "You've got a lot of land here," the leader continued, his eyes narrowing. "It's a shame that it's all wasted on a man like you. Looks like you're just waiting for something to come along and take it." The leader's words were a clear threat, but Jethro's expression didn't change. He stood tall, his posture unbending, his hands loose at his sides. He had dealt with men like this before, bullies who thought they could take what didn't belong to them, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. The leader took a step closer, eyeing Jethro with contempt. "Tell you what," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You can either hand over what you've got and let us take it, or we can make you regret not cooperating." Jethro's grip on the pitchfork tightened, his knuckles white, but he didn't move. The silence between them stretched. The sun was almost gone now, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. The leader's smile faltered as he noticed the unwavering look in Jethro's eyes. There was something in those eyes, a quiet resolve, a confidence that didn't belong in a simple farmer. "You know," the leader said, lowering his voice, "I don't like being looked at like that. It makes me think you've got something to hide." The other two men started to approach, their hands resting on the hilt of their blades. The leader took another step forward, his hand twitching toward his own sword. "I'll ask you one more time, farmer. Hand over what you've got, or we'll take it by force." At that, Jethro's eyes narrowed slightly. He took a deep breath, his body poised like a coiled spring. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. And then, with a speed that belied his calm demeanor, Jethro made his move. In the blink of an eye, Jethro's body exploded into motion. The pitchfork, which had been hanging loosely by his side, was now a weapon, a tool of farming transformed into an instrument of defense. With a quick, fluid motion, he spun it through the air, its tines flashing like deadly steel as he swung it toward the closest outlaw. The first man was too slow. Jethro's strike landed with a sickening thud, the pitchfork catching the man in the chest, sending him tumbling backward, gasping for air. The momentum of the strike carried Jethro forward as well, his feet barely touching the ground as he closed the gap between him and the others. The leader's eyes widened in surprise, his hand reaching for his sword. But it was too late. Jethro was already upon him. His movements were fast, precise, and devastating. In one smooth motion, he dropped the pitchfork, his left hand coming up to deliver a powerful strike with his open palm, knocking the leader back. The man staggered, his knees buckling as the blow landed hard across his face. The second outlaw, who had been circling behind Jethro, drew his sword in a desperate attempt to catch the farmer off guard. But Jethro's instincts were razor-sharp. Without even looking, he pivoted on his heel, bringing his right elbow crashing into the outlaw's jaw, sending the man sprawling into the dirt. Jethro didn't stop to watch. His eyes stayed focused on the leader, who was now scrambling to draw his own blade. But it wasn't the weapon that Jethro was interested in. It was the man himself. With a speed that belied his age, Jethro lunged forward, grabbing the leader by the wrist and twisting violently, causing the sword to fall from the man's hand. Before the leader could even react, Jethro swept his legs out from under him with a swift kick, sending him crashing to the ground. "Enough!" Jethro's voice was low, calm, yet filled with an unspoken fury. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. But the sheer weight of his presence, of his movements, left no room for doubt. The leader lay in the dirt, gasping, his face red with the shame of being so easily overwhelmed. He looked up at Jethro with a mix of awe and fear, his body frozen in the dirt as he realized the truth. The man he had come to rob was no simple farmer. Jethro straightened, looking down at the man with piercing eyes that seemed to see through him. "You think this is the way you earn respect?" Jethro asked, his voice almost a whisper. "By stealing from people who've worked their whole lives just to survive?" The leader, too terrified to answer, didn't even try to lift his gaze. The realization that he had misjudged the man in front of him, misjudged the silent farmer, was settling in quickly. The other two outlaws had barely recovered from the brutal onslaught, and now, they too were standing still, hesitant. "You're not even worth the time to finish off," Jethro continued, his words chilling in their calmness. He turned his back to the leader, who was still sprawled out on the ground, trying to catch his breath. The second man, the one who had tried to attack from behind, was still groaning in pain, his face twisted in anguish from the force of Jethro's strike. He scrambled to his feet, his sword drawn in shaky hands, his eyes wide with panic. He was scared, and rightfully so. Jethro's hand instinctively went to the sheath at his side, where a long, curved sword rested. The outlaws didn't know this. No one outside of his old life knew. But Jethro was no simple farmer. He was once the most feared swordsman in the kingdom, a warrior known for his precision and speed in battle. The sword slid smoothly from its sheath with a sound like a whisper of death. Jethro's eyes flicked over to the remaining outlaw, who immediately froze, his face pale as he watched the weapon glint in the low light of the evening. "You," Jethro spoke again, his tone unchanged, though the weight of his words cut through the night like the edge of his blade. "Leave. Now." The outlaw's breath came in ragged gasps. His body trembled with the knowledge that in another life, in another time, he would have been dead by now. But Jethro wasn't here to kill them. He was here to show them that they had chosen the wrong farm, the wrong person to threaten. "Go," Jethro repeated, his voice unwavering. Without another word, the second outlaw dropped his sword and turned to flee. The leader, still trembling on the ground, scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking as he grabbed for his fallen weapon. The two of them didn't even dare to look back as they retreated, bolting down the road away from the farm as fast as their legs would carry them. Jethro watched them go, his sword still drawn, his muscles taut with the remnants of the fight. But his mind was calm, too calm. He had trained for moments like this, had faced worse odds in his youth. But even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. It wasn't just the fight that felt different. It was the reminder of who he had once been. He sheathed his sword with a fluid motion, the leather of the scabbard making a faint, satisfying noise as it slid back into place. He turned to look at his farm, his quiet life. The animals were still grazing, the crops still growing. But the peace he had sought for so long was no longer as certain as it once had been. Jethro knew that this was just the beginning. The outlaws who had come to rob him weren't the only ones out there. The kingdom was filled with men like them, men who thought only of themselves, who preyed on the weak. And Jethro was beginning to understand something that had been buried deep within him for years. He couldn't hide from the past forever. Sooner or later, the world would come knocking on his door again. And this time, he would be ready. The night settled back into a strange quiet, the chaos of the brief confrontation fading into the distant past. The sun had finally disappeared below the horizon, and the air had grown cooler, but Jethro didn't feel the chill. His body remained tense, his senses still alive with the echo of the fight. He couldn't remember the last time he'd drawn his sword, the last time he'd felt the familiar rhythm of battle coursing through him. It had been too long. The farm, the life he had built, was quiet again, as it always had been. But something was different now. The calm seemed less like peace and more like the stillness before a storm. He couldn't push away the feeling that the outlaw's arrival was just the beginning, that the quiet life he had worked so hard to cultivate was beginning to unravel. He had spent years turning away from violence, turning away from the very life that had once defined him, but deep down, he knew that it was never truly gone. It had only been waiting. Jethro turned to face the barn, where the horses were tethered. He needed to check on them, make sure everything was in order, but his mind wandered, his thoughts drifting to the two men who had just fled. They had been desperate, but something in their eyes told him that they weren't just the common thieves he had once dealt with in his youth. There was fear there, yes, but also something more. A sense that they had seen something in him, something that made them rethink their decision. It was more than just the speed of his movements or the power of his strike. It was the weight of his presence. The years he had spent as a swordsman still haunted him. He had left that life behind. He had chosen peace, a quiet existence with no battles, no bloodshed. He had sworn to never return to the man he had once been. But the world had a way of pulling a man back into the fight, even when he tried to escape. As he approached the barn, Jethro heard the sound of approaching hooves again. His body stiffened in an instant. His hand went instinctively to the handle of his sword, but this time, he hesitated. He had already shown the outlaws that he wasn't a man to be trifled with, but something in his gut told him this wasn't the same group. This time, it was different. The sound of hooves grew louder, and soon a lone rider appeared at the edge of the farm. Jethro's eyes narrowed as he saw the figure approaching. It wasn't an outlaw this time. This rider had the look of someone who wasn't just passing through. The rider was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his cloak billowing slightly in the evening wind. He rode a sturdy chestnut horse, and there was a quiet confidence in the way he handled the reins. He wasn't a bandit. He wasn't an enemy, but Jethro still didn't trust him. The rider slowed as he approached, his eyes scanning the farm, taking in the quiet land. When he saw Jethro standing in the open, waiting, he brought his horse to a stop. The man didn't seem threatening, but Jethro knew better than to take anything at face value. "You must be Jethro," the man called out, his voice deep and commanding, but not unfriendly. "I've heard the name whispered in the towns. They say you were once the king's blade, the most feared swordsman in the land." Jethro didn't move, his gaze fixed on the man as he approached. He could feel the weight of the words, the king's blade, the most feared swordsman. He had spent so many years distancing himself from that life, hiding from the man he had once been. But it seemed that others weren't ready to let him forget. "I'm no longer that man," Jethro said, his voice flat, the calmness hiding the storm within. "I tend to my farm now. That's all." The rider dismounted gracefully, his movements sure and calculated. He was not here for a fight, Jethro could tell that much, but his presence still made the hairs on Jethro's neck stand on end. The rider was no simple traveler. "I'm not here to make trouble," the man said, walking slowly toward Jethro. "I've heard rumors that you're hiding out here, far from the violence, that you've gone soft, hidden away from the world. But I've also heard stories of what you did in your time, and I don't believe it. I don't believe you've truly left that life behind." Jethro's grip tightened slightly on the pitchfork in his hand, but his posture remained relaxed. He wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but he wasn't ready to let his guard down. The man continued, his gaze piercing, studying Jethro carefully. "I'm here because we need you. The kingdom needs you. The rebellion is growing stronger, and there's no one left with the skill, the power, to stand against it. We need a warrior, Jethro, a king's blade." Jethro's eyes hardened, and for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something long buried deep within him. He knew what the man was asking, even before he finished speaking. It wasn't just about the kingdom. It wasn't just about defending against an uprising. It was about the call to fight, the pull of battle. And Jethro knew that once that call had been made, there was no turning back. "I've left that life behind," Jethro said again, his voice firm. "I have no part in this rebellion, no part in your war. I am a farmer, and that's all I will ever be." The rider studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a deep sigh, he nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "I had hoped you would be different," the rider said quietly, "but I see you've made your choice. Still, remember this. There are those who still remember who you were. And there are some of us who are willing to fight, even if it's alone." With that, the rider turned, mounting his horse again. He didn't look back as he spurred the horse into motion, riding off into the darkening evening. Jethro stood there, watching the rider disappear into the distance, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The world was coming for him again, whether he wanted it or not. The evening faded into night, and Jethro stood in the growing darkness, still feeling the weight of the rider's words pressing into him. He had turned his back on that life long ago, what had once been the very essence of his existence. The sword, the battles, the fear and respect that had come with his name. It all seemed like a distant dream now. The quiet, simple life he had fought to build was all that mattered now. And yet, the call to arms, the voice of the man on the horse, lingered in his mind, like a dull ache he couldn't shake off. Jethro turned his back to the empty field, walking slowly toward the house. The farmhouse was quiet, peaceful, just as it had been before the rider arrived. The faint glow of candlelight flickered through the windows, the warmth of home wrapping around him like a protective cloak. He could still hear the horse's hooves echoing in his mind, but he chose to focus on the life he had carved for himself. He would not be swayed. And yet, there was a gnawing sense of unease in his gut. The rider had been right about one thing. The rebellion was growing stronger, and no one had risen to meet it. The kingdom was fragmented, its strength dissolved by years of unrest. The land that Jethro had once sworn to protect was now on the verge of being swallowed by chaos. But this had never been Jethro's fight anymore. He had seen enough bloodshed in his youth to last a lifetime. The life of a farmer, the piece of the earth beneath his hands, had been his redemption. He could hear the sound of something in the distance, Muffled voices, the faint clattering of hooves. His hand instinctively went to the pitchfork resting by the door, his fingers brushing its handle. Jethro shook his head, as if trying to rid himself of the thoughts that had already begun to fill his mind. But as the sounds drew closer, a familiar dread filled him. The same feeling that had gripped him during the last confrontation with the outlaws. His heart pounded in his chest, and he forced himself to look out across the open fields. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, a shadow emerged, a rider on horseback, moving at a fast clip, kicking up dust as he approached the farm. His heart sank as he realized the rider wasn't alone. More figures appeared in the distance, several men on horseback, their silhouettes just visible against the twilight. Jethro felt the pulse of adrenaline surge through him. It wasn't a band of outlaws this time, but something worse. These were men on a mission. He could tell by the way they rode, the way they closed in on the farm with a purpose. His mind raced. They weren't outlaws, nor were they simple travelers. These men were organized, and there were too many for a lone farmer to handle. He moved quickly, gathering the tools he had laid aside after the last skirmish. This time, the pitchfork wasn't enough. He needed something more. Something that would give him a chance against whatever they had in store for him. Jethro's heart pounded as his hands moved to the shed. He stepped inside and found what he was looking for. His sword. The same blade that had once belonged to the kingdom. The blade that had served him in countless battles. The blade that had ended the lives of men, sometimes with a single swing. It was heavier now, older, rusted slightly with disuse, but it was still sharp, still lethal. His fingers wrapped around the hilt, the familiar weight grounding him. His past was back now, whether he liked it or not. The horsemen were closer now, their horses' hooves pounding against the dirt road. There was no escaping this. Jethro walked back out, sword in hand, and stood in the middle of the farmyard. The world seemed to slow around him as he waited for the men to approach. The riders halted just a few yards from where Jethro stood. The leader, a tall man with a rough-hewn face, was the first to speak. "Jethro," he called out, his voice low and calculating. "I was hoping you would be here. It's been a long time since I've seen your face, old friend." Jethro's eyes narrowed. He recognized the voice immediately. It was a voice from his past, a voice he had hoped he would never hear again. "Barton," Jethro muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the sword. Barton had been a comrade once, another man who fought beside him in the king's army. But that was a lifetime ago, before betrayal and war had scattered them all. Barton was no longer the soldier Jethro had known. He had changed. They all had. Barton smiled grimly, as if enjoying the moment. "You haven't been too difficult to find, Jethro. We all knew you were hiding somewhere out here, trying to be forgotten. But you should know, you can't outrun the world. And the world needs you." Jethro's voice was cold. "I've left that life behind." The other riders laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was taunting, mocking. "You may have left it behind, but it hasn't left you," Barton said, his smile fading. "You still have that fire in your eyes. I can see it. You still have the skill, and we need it." Jethro stood still, his sword steady by his side. He had no interest in what Barton had to say. The rebellion was not his fight, not anymore. He was a farmer, nothing more. His days of bloodshed were over. "You're wasting your time," Jethro said, his voice firm, but inside, his heart was beating faster. He couldn't deny the pull. The call to fight again, to protect what he had worked so hard to build, was strong. But he had left that life behind for a reason. He would not return to it now. Barton dismounted his horse, taking a few steps closer, his eyes cold and determined. "You don't understand, Jethro. The kingdom is on the brink. It's not just about the rebellion. It's about everything you once fought for. Everything we fought for. You're not the only one who's been hiding. The kingdom needs its sword again, and you're the only one who can wield it." Jethro's eyes darkened. The temptation to return to the life of a warrior was there, but he resisted. He had fought wars, bled for kings who didn't deserve it, and seen the destruction that came with it. He was not a pawn to be used again. "I'm not your weapon anymore," Jethro said, his voice steady and cold. Barton's eyes flickered with something darker. "You don't have a choice," he said, his tone turning threatening. "The world needs you, Jethro, whether you like it or not." The tension in the air was thick, the weight of their unspoken words hanging between them like a storm about to break. The air between them seemed to thicken, the words hanging in the heavy silence like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Jethro's heart beat steadily, but inside, a maelstrom of emotions raged. He had fought wars. He had bled for causes that had been lost. He had held a blade in his hands for reasons that no longer seemed just. Yet here, with Barton standing before him, the old stirrings of battle began to flicker within him like embers in the dark. "You don't understand," Jethro said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of regret. "I've seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime. I've paid the price for my choices, Barton. I'm not the man you knew. I'm not your soldier anymore." Barton's eyes hardened, and he took another step forward. "You think I don't know what you've sacrificed? You think I don't know the price of war? We've all lost something, Jethro. But we're here, we're still alive, and we can still make a difference. The kingdom needs its sword, and you are the only one left who can wield it." Jethro stood firm, his eyes locked on Barton, but inside, the old warrior within him stirred. He could feel it. His muscles remembered the rhythm of battle, the sting of steel in his hand. He could almost feel the weight of the sword, the connection to it, but it was still buried beneath layers of years lived in peace, in solitude, in farming. Jethro took a deep breath and shook his head. "I made a promise to myself a long time ago. I left that life behind." The silence stretched as Barton's gaze never wavered. The men who had accompanied him stood silently behind him, waiting for their leader to speak, to make the first move. Jethro could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken challenge that hung between them. Then, Barton spoke again, his voice low but carrying a threat beneath it. "You think you can run from your past? From what you are? You can hide, Jethro, but when the kingdom burns, it will burn with or without you. And you can either stand by, hiding behind this farm, or you can pick up that sword again and defend what's left. You're not a farmer, Jethro. You're a warrior. And deep down, you know it." Jethro's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, the temptation to draw it sharp, immediate. His mind flickered back to the training, the battles, the victories he had earned with the sword. He could feel the pull. He had been forged in the fires of war, honed like a blade in battle. But his heart, his soul, had burned with a different fire for so long. The fire of peace, of the earth beneath his feet, of tending to something that grew, that lived without the need for bloodshed. Yet here was Barton, pushing at the very thing he had tried to bury. The weight of his past was like a shadow that stretched long behind him, and no matter how much he tried to outrun it, it was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of his sight. "I'm not your weapon anymore," Jethro said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the strength of his conviction clear. "You can take your men, and you can leave." Barton's eyes narrowed, but for the first time, Jethro saw something like respect flash in them. Barton knew, deep down, that Jethro was not the man he had hoped to sway. He knew that Jethro had chosen his path, but Barton wasn't one to give up easily. He stepped closer, his voice firm. "You know, I've seen men like you before. They think they can outrun their past. But there's always a moment when it catches up to them. You've already faced your demons once. Your blood was spilled for a kingdom that never appreciated it. Now, the world calls for you again. You can run, you can hide, but you cannot ignore it forever." The word stung, more than Jethro cared to admit. He had spent so many years trying to ignore the call of war, the pull of battle. But even now, even after everything, he could still hear it echoing in his bones. Jethro stood there for a long moment, his mind a tempest. He could see the other riders, standing silently, watching him, waiting. The wind picked up slightly, the quiet rustling of the grass beneath their feet carrying the faintest hint of tension. He turned his back to Barton and walked toward his farmhouse, his steps measured and steady. The sword still rested at his side, but he didn't reach for it. "Not yet. You came here expecting me to fight for you," Jethro said over his shoulder, his voice low, controlled. "But you don't get to choose when I fight. I fight on my terms. Barton's voice followed him. One last attempt. The kingdom needs a leader. Someone to inspire them. You may not want to be that man. But if you don't stand up, everything you've fought to protect, everything you've worked for here, will be destroyed. They'll burn this place down, and they'll come for you next. For all of us. Jethro paused, his hand resting on the doorframe of his farmhouse, his back still to Barton. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool air wash over him. He had heard enough. Barton's words had a ring of truth to them. But Jethro knew that this wasn't a fight he could just step into again. This wasn't just about a kingdom or a rebellion. It was about his soul. It was about whether he could take up the sword again without becoming the man he had once been. A man defined by bloodshed, by violence. I'm not the man you're looking for, Barton, Jethro said, his voice quiet but resolute. And I won't be your weapon. With that, Jethro stepped inside the house, closing the door behind him with a finality that rang in the still air. He would not be drawn back into this life. He had fought for too long to protect peace, to protect something better than the endless cycle of violence. Outside, Barton stood silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the door, and then he turned away. His men followed him, and without another word, they rode off into the night. The kingdom still needed its sword, but Jethro had chosen to live without it. For now, the silence that followed Barton and his men's departure was oppressive. Jethro stood in the doorway of his farmhouse, the weight of his decision hanging heavy on his shoulders. The sun had fully set now, leaving the world outside cloaked in shadows. The flicker of the lantern inside was the only source of light in the small room, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Jethro closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the peace to settle over him, but it didn't last long. The battle inside him had not subsided with Barton's retreat. No, it was just beginning to rage. He had left that life behind. The blood-soaked battles, the cries of war, the deaths of men and friends alike. He had walked away from the violence, buried his sword, and carved out a life of simplicity. He had fought for peace, fought to be free of the haunting memories of what he had done and what had been done to him. He had wanted to build something different, something real, something that didn't depend on the sword. But Barton had been right about one thing. You can never truly outrun your past. The moment he had stepped outside and faced the riders, the moment the sword had been drawn in his hand, he had felt that familiar stirring within him, that same cold fury that had defined him in the heat of battle. The strength, the speed, the power. It had all come rushing back as if it had never left. It was the same feeling he had known in the king's army, the same force that had made him one of the most feared swordsmen in the land. Jethro rubbed his temples as though trying to wipe away the thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. The silence of the farm seemed to mock him now. The stillness of the world outside felt like a lie, a thin veil over the truth. He could already feel the pull of something much larger than himself, something that would soon sweep him into a fight he hadn't chosen. The rebellion was growing, and sooner or later, it would come for him, whether he wanted it to or not. The weight of the sword on his back seemed to grow heavier, and he realized, with a bitter sense of clarity, that his past wasn't something he could leave behind. Not forever. Suddenly, a knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was sharp, urgent, and unexpected. Jethro tensed, instinctively reaching for the handle of the door, his fingers brushing against the familiar, worn wood. He wasn't sure who could be coming at this hour, but his instincts told him it wasn't good. He opened the door slowly, just enough to peek outside. Standing before him was a young man, no older than 20, dressed in rough clothes, his face pale and frantic. The young man looked up at Jethro with wide eyes, clearly afraid. "Please," the young man gasped, his breath coming in quick, ragged bursts. "You've got to help us. They're coming for us." Jethro's gaze hardened as the weight of the words sank in. "Who?" he asked, his voice low. "The rebels. They found us. They're raiding every farm on the outskirts. My family." The young man stopped, his throat tightening with emotion. "They've already taken some of the other farms. We need to leave. We need to hide, but I don't know where to go." Jethro stepped back, allowing the young man inside. He shut the door quietly behind him, the gravity of the situation beginning to settle over him. The rebellion had already spread to the outer farms. The land he had fought to protect, the land that had once been peaceful, was now caught in the crossfire. And there was nowhere to run. "Get inside," Jethro ordered, his voice firm as he motioned for the young man to sit at the table. "What happened?" The young man took a shaky seat at the table, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He was clearly shaken, and Jethro could see the fear in his eyes. The fear of someone who had just been caught in a storm they had no power to control. "They came in the dead of night," the young man began, his voice quivering. "They rode through the farms, setting fire to the crops, tearing through the homes. They don't care. It's like they're trying to wipe us all out." Jethro felt the blood drain from his face as the young man spoke. This was it, the rebellion. The chaos that had been building for years was now at his doorstep. They had already begun to burn the land, to claim it for themselves. And there was nowhere to hide. "How many?" Jethro asked, his voice low, his eyes narrowing as he started to think, to plan. The farmer in him still remained, the man who had spent years looking for solutions, for ways to survive. But the warrior was stirring again, and Jethro knew that the time for hiding was over. The young man gulped. "I don't know. A dozen or more." They came in fast, moving through the farms like they knew exactly where to strike. Jethro's hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He could feel the sword on his back, its weight pulling him toward a decision he had been dreading. The war had come for him, whether he wanted it or not. He could feel the farm, his peace, slipping away, and he had only one choice now. The young man looked up at him, his eyes pleading, desperate. "Please, sir, we need help. They're going to kill us. I don't know who else to turn to." Jethro's gaze softened, and for a moment, he thought of his life, of the quiet years he had spent alone, of the peace he had fought for. But he also thought of the land, of the people who still lived here, of the young man in front of him. His resolve hardened. "I'll help," Jethro said, his voice steady. "But we're not running. We'll stand and fight." The young man blinked, surprised by the change in Jethro's tone, by the calm certainty in his voice. You will?" Jethro's hand slid from the table to the sword at his side, and for the first time in years, he felt its weight in a way he hadn't before. The battle was coming. The past was coming for him, and there was no escaping it. "Yes," Jethro said quietly. "We'll fight." The young man's eyes widened at Jethro's words, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hope, a brief light that seemed to shine in the midst of the gathering darkness. Jethro, standing tall and calm, felt a strange weight settle on his shoulders. It wasn't just the weight of his sword, nor the weight of the memories of his past. It was the weight of a promise he had made to himself long ago, a promise to never return to the violence, the bloodshed, the chaos of war. But in the young man's pleading gaze, Jethro saw something else, something that no one could turn away from. Fear, desperation. The people of the land were being hunted, and Jethro had been in that position before. He had seen what it was like to be trapped, cornered, and without hope. But now, he had a choice to make. And for the first time in years, Jethro was faced with a question he couldn't ignore. "Where are they coming from?" Jethro asked, his voice low, his mind already working through the possibilities. The young man swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "From the south. They've been raiding the villages there for weeks, but it's getting worse. The leaders of the rebellion are gathering their forces. They say the king's bloodline is finished, that the crown is nothing but a symbol of the old world. They want to burn it all down." Jethro's jaw tightened as the young man spoke. He had heard the rumors of the rebellion growing stronger, of the chaos spreading like wildfire across the kingdom, but hearing it from someone so close to the front lines made it feel all too real. Jethro turned toward the window, staring out into the night. The stillness of the farm, the quiet he had fought so hard to preserve, seemed to mock him now. His eyes scanned the distance, beyond the horizon, where he knew the rebels were marching. He could feel their presence even from here, like an encroaching shadow. And deep down, Jethro knew that the moment he picked up his sword, he wouldn't just be fighting for his farm. He would be fighting for the very land itself. "Do you know how many they are?" Jethro asked, turning back to the young man, who was standing with his head bowed, fear still evident in his eyes. A dozen, maybe more. They ride in groups, raiding as they go. We don't have much time. Jethro nodded, the thoughts in his mind clear now. He could feel the fire of battle slowly awakening within him, a flame he had tried to snuff out for so long. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the knowledge of what he was about to do. This wasn't just a skirmish. This wasn't just about defending his farm. This was the beginning of something much larger, something that would demand everything he had left. There's no running from this, Jethro muttered to himself, almost as if reassuring his own conscience. We fight. The young man looked up at him, a flicker of gratitude and disbelief crossing his face. You'll fight with us? You'll stand against them? Jethro met the young man's gaze with a somber nod. Yes, he said, his voice firm. I'll stand with you, but we'll need to be smart. We need to defend the farm, but we can't face them head-on without preparation. The young man nodded, his eyes wide, filled with a mix of awe and relief. He had come seeking help, but what Jethro had just offered was more than he could have hoped for. Jethro moved toward the door, pulling it open with a quiet creak. The air outside was cool, the scent of the earth fresh and comforting. It felt like any other night, but he knew that by morning, everything would change. Gather the people, Jethro instructed, his voice calm, even though he could feel the storm building inside him. Anyone who can fight. I need you to gather the tools we'll use. Spears, pitchforks, anything we can make use of. We're not soldiers, but we'll defend this place with everything we have. The young man nodded and quickly moved to follow Jethro's orders, eager to do his part. But Jethro lingered a moment longer, staring out into the night, his mind running through the actions he would take. He knew the farm, knew the land better than anyone, and he would use every advantage he had to defend it. But there was something else, something that nagged at the back of his mind. He could already hear the distant sound of hooves, the drums of war beating closer with each passing second. The rebellion wasn't just coming for the farm, it was coming for everything. And Jethro knew, deep down, that if they took his farm, they would come for the rest of the land. For the people. Jethro's grip tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles white. He had hoped to live out his days in peace, away from the violence that had defined his earlier years. But the world had not allowed him that luxury. It was time to fight again. The young man returned, bringing a handful of villagers with him. Young men and women, some old enough to carry weapons, others too young to truly understand the gravity of what they were about to face. But they were here. They were ready. Jethro nodded at them, his expression hardening as he stepped outside, his sword now in hand. We don't have much time, he said, his voice cutting through the growing tension in the air. When they come, we'll make our stand here. The farm is our home, and we won't give it up without a fight. The villagers looked at him, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. But Jethro saw something else in their eyes, a spark, a willingness to stand together. It was the same spirit that had once united kingdoms in battle, the same spirit that had once driven Jethro to fight for causes greater than himself. We'll fight, one of the young men said, his voice shaking but filled with determination. We'll protect what's ours. Jethro looked at them, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He wasn't just leading them into battle. He was leading them into a war that could cost them everything. Then let's make sure they know that this farm and this land isn't theirs to take, Jethro said, his voice low and fierce. And with that, the battle began. The storm that had been building on the horizon was now upon them. They would fight, not just for the farm, but for their homes, for their future. The tension in the air was palpable. Jethro, sword in hand, stood at the front of the group of villagers who had gathered to defend the farm. The young man, still trembling but resolute, had returned with the others, farmers, tradesmen, and children, each armed with whatever they could find. Pitchforks, knives, hastily made spears. They were no soldiers, but in the face of the rebellion, they were all that stood between the farm and destruction. Jethro surveyed the group, his sharp eyes scanning their faces, memorizing their weaknesses and strengths. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him, the weight of the man he used to be, the warrior who had once commanded armies. He had hoped never to return to that life. But here, in the shadows of the looming rebellion, it seemed inevitable. "They'll come from the south," Jethro said, his voice steady, his gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. "We'll set up defenses here, near the barn. It's the most defensible position on the land." The young man who had sought Jethro's help stood at his side, his eyes wide with uncertainty but filled with a newfound determination. "What should we do first?" Jethro's gaze flicked toward the others, his mind already working. He couldn't afford to hesitate. "We'll need to make a barricade. Gather whatever wood you can find. Old planks, logs, anything to slow them down. We can't allow them to rush us all at once." As the villagers scattered, Jethro's mind was not on the immediate task of building defenses. It was on the coming fight, on what they would face when the rebels arrived. He had seen it before. Seen men who had once been farmers, who had once been peaceful, turned into warriors by necessity. And he knew that if these people were to stand a chance, they would need more than just courage. They would need discipline. Jethro stepped forward, raising his voice to rally the group. "Listen," he called, his tone cutting through the noise. "This is no simple raid. These men, the rebels, they've been trained for war. They won't hesitate to kill us. But we have something they don't. We know this land. We know these fields, these hills. We use what we have to our advantage. And we fight together." The villagers stopped in their tracks, turning to face him. Jethro's words had a weight to them that none could ignore. The reminder of what they were up against, of the lives they stood to lose, grounded them in a shared purpose. "We'll form a perimeter around the barn," Jethro continued, his voice steady, calm. "Keep your distance, but don't let them get too close. When they come, we make them regret it. You fight for this land, for your homes and for each other." The villagers nodded, their resolve hardening. They began moving with a sense of urgency, collecting wood, barricading the barn entrance. Jethro stepped away from the group, his eyes once again scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sky darkened with the approach of night, but Jethro didn't relax. The quiet only made the approaching danger feel all the more inevitable. He could hear the distant thunder of hooves now, the rhythmic pounding getting louder as the rebels closed in. There was no more time to prepare. Jethro turned back to the group, his eyes locking with the young man who had sought his help. "Stay behind the barricade," Jethro said, his tone stern. "Keep your head down. Only fight if you must." The young man nodded, his face pale but determined. He hadn't expected to be thrust into a fight like this, but there was no turning back now. He understood what Jethro was asking. He understood what was at stake. Jethro reached down to his side, his fingers brushing against the familiar hilt of his sword. The cold steel was a stark reminder of the life he had left behind, but it was also the only weapon he had that could make a difference now. He pulled it from its sheath, the sharp ring of the blade sounding as it sliced through the air. As the first rider appeared over the horizon, Jethro felt the world shift. His pulse quickened, his grip on the sword firm. He had fought many battles before, battles for kings and for men who had long since forgotten his name. But this was different. This wasn't for a crown. This wasn't for glory. This was for survival. The rebels emerged from the trees, a dozen or more, riding in tight formation, their faces hidden beneath their cloaks and hoods. Their horses moved in a steady, controlled rhythm, but Jethro could see the tension in their movements. They were ready to strike, but they hadn't yet realized what they were up against. Jethro stood tall, sword at the ready, his posture unyielding as the rebels approached. He knew they were looking for an easy target, another farm to pillage, another life to crush, but he would not make it easy for them. He would not let them take this land without a fight. The first rider came closer, his sword raised, eyes fixed on the farm and the small group of villagers. But as he neared, Jethro stepped forward, his blade slicing through the air with a deadly grace. The rider's eyes widened in surprise as Jethro's strike knocked his sword out of his hand, sending it flying into the dirt. Jethro's foot moved forward in a smooth, practiced motion, sweeping the rider's legs from under him and sending him tumbling to the ground. Without missing a beat, Jethro was on him, his sword pointed at the rider's chest. "Leave now," Jethro said, his voice cold, but carrying an undeniable weight. "Or I will make sure you regret it." The other rebels halted, clearly surprised by the speed and precision of Jethro's attack. But they didn't retreat. Instead, they began to dismount, preparing for a fight of their own. Jethro's eyes flicked back to the villagers behind the barricade. They were ready, their weapons in hand, their expressions hardened by fear, but also by the will to survive. It was time. The battle had begun. The first strike had been made, and the rebels, stunned by the farmer's swift and decisive action, hesitated just long enough for Jethro to press his advantage. He had fought countless battles, but none like this. This wasn't an army of professional soldiers or trained fighters. It was a band of rebels, men who had picked up weapons for a cause but lacked the discipline of real warriors. But even the most ill-prepared men could be dangerous when their blood was up, and Jethro knew it. He couldn't underestimate them, couldn't afford to let his guard down for a second. The leader of the rebels, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, was the first to react. With a shout, he signaled to the others to advance. His sword was drawn, its edge gleaming darkly in the twilight. His eyes burned with the ferocity of someone who had seen too much, someone who had taken too many lives to turn back now. "Kill him," the leader bellowed. "Take the farm." Jethro's eyes narrowed. He wasn't fighting for land or wealth or even the crown. He was fighting for the people who had gathered here. These villagers, these men and women who had never asked for war. They had no choice now. He was their shield. The rebels surged forward, some on foot, others still mounted. Jethro didn't wait for them to reach him. He moved like a shadow, his blade a streak of silver in the darkening night. The first rebel who came within reach was a young man, barely out of his teens. He swung a heavy axe at Jethro's head, but Jethro ducked beneath it, the axe cutting through the air just above him. With a swift movement, Jethro's sword came up, slicing through the young man's side with surgical precision. The rebel crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath as the life drained from him. Jethro barely spared him a second glance. He was already moving to the next target. The leader of the rebels, seeing one of his men fall, advanced on Jethro with a snarl, his sword held high. "You think you can stop us, farmer?" he spat. "You're outnumbered. You'll die just like the rest of them." Jethro didn't flinch, didn't show fear. He had heard threats like this 100 times before, from kings, from enemies, from men who thought they could intimidate him. But Jethro was a different man now. He wasn't fighting for anyone's glory, and he wasn't afraid to die. He was simply fighting for survival, for his farm, for the life he had built. The leader swung his sword in a wide arc, aiming for Jethro's chest. It was a powerful strike, but it lacked the precision that Jethro was used to. He stepped back, his sword moving like lightning to deflect the blow. The leader's momentum carried him forward, off balance, and Jethro took advantage of the opening. With a quick twist of his wrist, Jethro's blade found the gap in the leader's defense, cutting through his shoulder. The leader staggered back, a look of shock crossing his face as he dropped his sword, clutching his wound. "You're not worth my time," Jethro said coldly, wiping the blood from his blade. The leader glared at him, his lips curling in a snarl, but he knew better than to continue the fight. He turned and retreated, barking orders for his men to fall back. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The rebels were scattered now, some of them still fighting, others already turning to flee. Jethro stood in the middle of the farm, his sword still drawn, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The villagers, though inexperienced, had managed to hold their ground. The barricades had slowed the rebels' charge, and with Jethro at the front, they had managed to push the attackers back. "Hold your ground," Jethro shouted, his voice carrying over the battlefield. "Don't let them regroup. Stay focused." The villagers nodded, some of them gathering their courage, others still trembling with fear, but all of them determined to stand. They were fighting not for glory, but for survival, for their homes. Jethro's gaze flicked back to the rebels, who had formed up a short distance away, regrouping and preparing for another charge. He could see the leader, still clutching his wound, barking orders at his men. They were disorganized now, their confidence shaken by Jethro's swift counterattack. "We don't let them regroup," Jethro muttered under his breath. He turned to the young man who had come to him for help. "Gather the others. Get ready to finish this." The young man nodded, his fear now replaced with determination. He quickly moved to organize the villagers, directing them to gather their weapons and prepare for what was to come. Jethro turned back to the rebels. He could see the desperation in their eyes now. The violence they had hoped to bring to the farm had been met with resistance, something they hadn't counted on. They thought Jethro was just a simple farmer. They thought his blade had been buried in the past. But they hadn't realized the truth. The truth that Jethro had once been the kingdom's greatest swordsman. And now, he was willing to fight for the people who called this land home. The leader of the rebels saw the shift in the battlefield, and for a moment, his eyes flickered with uncertainty. Jethro had struck fear into him, and that was something that men like him couldn't easily overcome. But the leader wasn't one to give up so easily. He bellowed one final command, rallying his men for one last push. Jethro felt the tension in the air. He knew what was coming. This would be the final charge, the last stand. They couldn't allow the rebels to regroup again. This time, they would have to end it. "Ready yourselves," Jethro shouted, stepping forward, his sword raised in readiness. "We fight until they leave or they fall. We protect our homes." The villagers gathered behind him, their weapons ready, their faces set. They weren't soldiers, but they had something the rebels didn't, a reason to fight. Jethro's sword gleamed in the dimming light, and as the rebels charged once more, he knew it was time to end this. The battle was far from over, but the tide had already begun to turn. The rebels surged forward, their swords raised and their eyes fixed on the barricades that had been hastily constructed around the barn. But this time, it was different. Jethro stood tall at the front, his sword gleaming in the fading light, his posture unyielding. The villagers, now steeled by the fight they had already endured, stood behind him, their weapons ready. The leader of the rebels, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, barked orders as he led the charge. His men, though shaken from the previous encounter, moved with the raw aggression of men who had nothing left to lose. The air was thick with the sound of hooves and the crunch of gravel beneath boots as the rebels closed in. "Hold your ground," Jethro called, his voice steady and commanding. "Don't let them break through. We stand together, or we fall together." The villagers gathered their courage, standing firm at their posts, eyes wide with the fear of the unknown, but bolstered by Jethro's unwavering resolve. They weren't soldiers, but they were fighting for something they could never replace. Their homes, their families, and the land that had given them everything. The first rebel reached the barricades, a tall man with wild eyes and a bloodthirsty grin. His sword swung in a wide arc, aiming for one of the villagers who had been nervously gripping a pitchfork. The young man's hands shook as he tried to raise his weapon, but Jethro was already moving. With a roar, Jethro dashed forward, his sword cutting through the air with a deadly arc. The rebel's sword clashed with Jethro's in a shower of sparks, but the impact was brief. With one swift motion, Jethro drove his blade into the rebel's side, and the man crumpled to the ground in a heap, blood spilling across the dirt. The villagers watched in awe, their fear turning to something else, something fierce, something determined. They had seen their first blood spilled and realized they were still standing, and that was enough. "Stay focused," Jethro shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "We fight to win." The leader of the rebels, seeing the death of one of his own, spurred his horse forward with a guttural yell. His eyes locked on Jethro, and for a moment, there was nothing but the two of them, locked in a deadly dance. The leader swung his sword in a broad arc, aiming for Jethro's head. But Jethro was faster. He ducked beneath the blow, his body moving like water, flowing beneath the blade with an ease that spoke of years of battle. His own sword flicked upward, deflecting the leader's strike and pushing him off balance. Before the rebel leader could regain his stance, Jethro closed the gap between them in an instant. His sword flashed, a blur of silver, and the leader's expression morphed from anger to terror as Jethro's blade cut deep into his side. The rebel leader staggered backward, his sword falling from his hand as he crumpled to the ground, clutching his wound. His breath came in short gasps, his body trembling with the shock of the blow. Jethro stood over him, his sword raised high. "Leave this land, or die like your men," Jethro growled, his voice low and menacing. The leader's eyes darted around him, seeing his men retreating in fear, seeing the conviction in Jethro's stance. His breath hitched in his throat, and for the first time, the leader realized just how outmatched they were. His rebellion had met its end here, on this small farm, in the hands of a man they had underestimated. With a final, guttural cry, the leader scrambled to his feet and signaled for his men to retreat. The remaining rebels, their morale shattered, hesitated for only a moment before they turned and fled into the night, their horses kicking up dust as they disappeared into the shadows. The farm fell silent. Jethro stood in the middle of the battlefield, his chest heaving with exertion, his sword dripping with the blood of the men who had tried to take everything from him. His mind was still spinning, still caught in the aftermath of the fight, but he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The farm was still his. The land was still theirs. The villagers slowly began to emerge from behind the barricades, their expressions a mix of disbelief and relief. Some were injured, but nothing life-threatening. They had survived. Against all odds, they had stood their ground and fought back. Jethro sheathed his sword with a smooth, practiced motion, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had stood with him. "We've won," he said, his voice steady, but the weight of the moment settling in. "But don't think this is over. We've sent a message, but the rebellion won't stop here. There are more of them out there, and they'll be back." The young man who had first come to Jethro with his plea for help stepped forward, his face pale but filled with gratitude. "You did it," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You protected us. You saved us." Jethro's gaze softened, though the weariness of the battle was still evident in his eyes. "No," he said simply, "we did it. You fought too. You fought for your homes, for your families." The villagers gathered around him, their expressions still filled with awe and disbelief. They had gone from being simple farmers to warriors in the blink of an eye, and in that moment, they realized that they had found something they hadn't known they were capable of. They had found the courage to fight. "Tonight, we rest," Jethro said, his voice firm. "Tomorrow, we begin again. We rebuild, and we prepare for whatever comes next." As the villagers began to move back into the farmhouse, helping each other and tending to the wounded, Jethro stood at the edge of the field, watching the last of the rebels disappear into the night. He knew the fight wasn't over, that this was only the beginning, but for tonight, they had won. They had taken a stand, and that was something that could not be taken away. In the stillness of the night, Jethro felt a quiet stirring in his chest, a sense of purpose, of resolve. The life he had tried to leave behind had found him again, but this time, it wasn't about the blood or the violence. It was about protecting the land, the people he had sworn to defend, and this time, he would fight not for a kingdom, but for something far more precious, his home. The night stretched long and tense, the aftermath of the battle settling over the farm like a heavy blanket. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, casting faint shadows across the land. The air was cool, the only sounds those of the night creatures, crickets, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the soft murmur of villagers tending to the wounded or preparing for the uncertain days ahead. Jethro stood at the edge of the field, his back to the farmhouse. His sword was clean, though he had not yet sheathed it. His eyes were distant as he surveyed the land he had sworn to protect, the soil that had given him peace, now stained with the blood of those who had come to take it from him. He could feel the weight of the past pressing on him, the history of who he had been, the man he had left behind. But he was not that man anymore. The kingdom he had once fought for, the blood he had once spilled for kings and queens, seemed a world away now. All that mattered in this moment was the land beneath his feet, the people behind him, and the choices he had made. The young man, still wide-eyed and unsure, approached him carefully, as though unsure of what to say or how to act. Jethro turned to face him, offering a brief, nodding acknowledgement. You were incredible out there," the young man said, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. "I didn't know what to expect, but you fought like a legend." Jethro's eyes softened, but his expression remained stoic. Legends are made in the heat of battle, but they fade just as quickly as the blood they shed. What matters now is what comes next. The young man swallowed hard, his face grim. But we won, right? We held them off. They won't come back, will they? Jethro sighed deeply and looked at the horizon. The battle they had fought tonight had been hard won, but it had been only the first. There were more rebels out there, more threats to the life they had built. He could feel it in the air, a gnawing sense of unease that he couldn't shake. They'll be back, Jethro said softly, his voice low and resolute. The rebellion won't stop here, and we'll have to be ready. This farm, this land, is just one small piece of a much larger war. We've made a stand, but the fight is far from over. The young man's face fell, and for the first time, Jethro saw the full weight of fear in his eyes. He wasn't used to this life, to the reality of war. Jethro knew that fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. The rebellion had already spread like wildfire across the land, and the only way to survive was to stand tall, to fight even when hope seemed distant. But how? The young man asked, his voice trembling. We're just farmers. What do we know about fighting? We know our land, Jethro said, turning to face the young man fully. We know these fields, these hills, better than anyone. And that's the advantage we have. We'll use what we have to fight. Our knowledge, our strength, and our will. You're not just farmers anymore. You're defenders of your home. The young man nodded slowly, his expression shifting from doubt to determination. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jethro could see that the spark of something had ignited in him, a willingness to fight. Gather the others, Jethro said, his voice firm. We'll need to organize. Reinforce the barricades, make sure the wounded are cared for. I want scouts on the outskirts of the farm. If the rebels are planning another attack, we need to be prepared. The young man nodded quickly, his nerves replaced with purpose. As he turned to leave, Jethro's gaze returned to the horizon once more, his thoughts clouded with the weight of the coming days. He had fought battles before, but those were battles for kings, for causes larger than him. This was different. This was personal. This was for his land, his people, and for the future of those who had chosen to stand beside him. He turned back toward the farmhouse, his steps slow but purposeful. There was work to be done. The fight wasn't over, and he couldn't afford to waste any time. As the villagers began to organize, Jethro's thoughts lingered on the rebellion and its leaders. He had seen the face of the enemy tonight, their desperation, their drive, and he knew that this would not be the last time they came knocking. They had underestimated him, thinking he was just a farmer, a relic of a past life. But Jethro was not the same man he had once been. He had no desire for glory, no need to prove himself, but he would fight, and he would protect this land with everything he had left. The young man returned with several others, and they quickly set to work. The night passed in a blur of preparation, of securing the farm, of tending to the wounded, and of watching the horizon. Jethro could feel the eyes of the villagers on him, waiting for his next command, waiting for the next step. But he didn't have all the answers. He could only do what he had always done, survive. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the land, Jethro stood at the edge of the field, his sword resting in his hand. The farm was still standing, but it was a farm under siege. He could see the smoke from nearby farms rising in the distance, the evidence of the rebellion's advance. The calm before the storm was over. Now, Jethro had to decide. Could they hold this land, this life, against the forces that sought to destroy it? And could he, a man who had left his past behind, summon the courage to lead these people into the battle that was coming? With one final glance at the farm, Jethro turned back to face the villagers. "We stand together," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of the future hung heavy in his chest. "And we fight. Whatever happens next, we fight." The first rays of dawn broke over the farm, casting long, golden shadows across the land. The smell of fresh earth mixed with the acrid scent of smoke in the air. Reminders of the battle that had been fought and the one that was still to come. Jethro stood with his back to the farmhouse, his sword now firmly gripped in his hands, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The farm had become a battleground. The fields once filled with life now quiet and still, save for the movement of the villagers working tirelessly to prepare for what was coming. It was clear now that the rebellion would not stop here. They had made their stand, but the cost of that stand was still uncertain. The weight of the coming fight settled on Jethro's shoulders, and though the villagers had rallied behind him, he knew they weren't ready for what lay ahead. They had fought bravely in the first skirmish, but this time, there would be no underestimating the enemy. Jethro's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. He could hear the faint sound of hooves in the distance, carried by the wind. His hand instinctively tightened on the hilt of his sword, his muscles tensing as his mind shifted back into that old place. The place where strategy and instinct met, where the knowledge of battle surfaced as easily as the sun rising in the morning. He turned back toward the barn, where the villagers had gathered. They were nervous, their faces grim, their hands trembling as they held onto the weapons they had gathered. No one had ever fought a battle like this, and no one truly knew what to expect. "Gather around," Jethro said, his voice steady and firm. The villagers looked up at him, some still unsure of their place in this new world. They were farmers, not soldiers, but they had come together to protect something precious, and that was a strength that Jethro would use. "We don't know how many are coming, but we know they'll be here soon," Jethro continued. "They will test our defenses, they'll try to break us, and they'll do everything they can to destroy what we've built. But we stand our ground. We will not be taken easily." The villagers nodded, their faces set with determination, but fear was still evident in their eyes. Jethro could feel it, too. The weight of the unknown was a heavy burden for them all, but it was a burden they would have to bear if they were to survive. "The barricades we've set up will slow them down," Jethro said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmur of the villagers. "But that's all they will do. If we fight them on the ground here, in the open, we won't survive. We need to draw them in, force them to fight on our terms." One of the older men, his face wrinkled with age but sharp with years of hard work, spoke up. "How do we do that, Jethro? How do we fight men who have come to take everything from us?" Jethro's eyes met the older man's. The weight of the question was not lost on him, but he had a plan. It wasn't much, but it was their best chance. "We fight the way we know how," Jethro replied. "We use the land. We know these fields better than they do. We know where to hide, where to strike, where to retreat. And we use that to our advantage." He looked out at the other villagers. "I need scouts, people who can move quickly and quietly, who can watch for their approach and give us the information we need." Several villagers stepped forward, eager to help, but Jethro could see the fear in their eyes. It wasn't the fear of the unknown anymore. It was the fear of losing what they had fought to protect. But that fear, Jethro knew, could be a strength. Fear could sharpen a person's resolve if used the right way. "We'll need traps," Jethro continued, pacing slowly before them. "We'll need to use the environment to slow them down, confuse them, make them think they have the upper hand. If we do this right, we can make them bleed before they get too close." The young man who had first come to Jethro stepped forward again, his face set with resolve. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice full of the fire that Jethro had seen growing in the villagers over the course of the night. Jethro nodded, his gaze settling on the group. He could see that they were ready, even if they didn't fully understand what was at stake. And that was enough. "We work in pairs," Jethro said, his voice hardening with finality. "We make our stand here, and we hold this land with everything we have. We'll take what little we know, and we'll turn it into a fight they won't forget. They may outnumber us, but they don't know this land like we do." With that, Jethro turned away from the villagers and started toward the field. The first sounds of the rebel cavalry grew louder, more distinct. His ears strained to catch the rhythm of the horses' hooves. The calm before the storm was over. Behind him, the villagers began to spread out, some moving toward the barricades, others making their way toward the edges of the farm where they would prepare to sabotage the rebels' approach. Jethro could feel the tension building, the impending conflict like the tightening of a string on a bow. But as he looked over his shoulder, he could see the determination in the eyes of the men and women who had chosen to stand with him. The rebels would come, and they would fight. But they would know that they weren't facing helpless farmers. They were facing a people who would do anything to protect their homes. The first rebel appeared over the ridge, his figure stark against the morning sky. Jethro's heart beat faster, and as the rest of the rebel riders followed, he stepped forward, sword in hand. It was time. The sound of hooves grew louder, the rebels' advance unmistakable as they neared the farm. Jethro stood at the forefront, his feet planted firmly in the soil that he had fought so hard to protect. The villagers had done as he instructed, spreading out, taking up positions behind barricades, and preparing their traps. They weren't soldiers, but Jethro had seen in their eyes something more powerful than training, the will to protect what was theirs. He could see the first riders cresting the hill. The rebels had come in force this time. Dozens of men on horseback, their weapons drawn and their faces set in determination. They had been pushed back once, but Jethro knew that wouldn't stop them. The rebellion would not be satisfied until they had taken everything from these people, from this land. Jethro's heart pounded in his chest, but his grip on the sword was steady. This time, there would be no retreat, no hesitation. The young man who had first sought Jethro's help stood beside him, his face pale, his hands trembling as he gripped a spear. Jethro could see the fear in his eyes, but also the resolve. The villagers had seen what Jethro was capable of, and they knew that they would not be alone in this fight. He was their leader, their protector, and they were ready to stand with him. "They're coming fast," the young man whispered. "What do we do now?" Jethro's voice was low and firm as he spoke. "Stay behind the barricades. When they get close enough, we draw them in. We use the traps. They don't know the land like we do." The first riders were almost upon them now. Jethro could see their faces. Young men, hardened by the war, their eyes filled with the fury of rebellion. They thought they were unstoppable. They thought they could take anything they wanted. But Jethro had learned long ago that the key to survival wasn't just strength. It was intelligence, strategy, and the willingness to fight for something more than just your own life. The rebels broke into a charge, their horses thundering across the field. Jethro raised his sword, his body poised and ready. He knew this was the moment that would determine everything. "Hold," he shouted. "Hold until they get close. Don't fire too soon." The villagers tensed, ready to follow his lead, their hands gripping their weapons, waiting for the signal. The rebels closed the distance, their horses pounding against the earth, the dust swirling in the wind. Jethro's heart raced, but his body was calm. Every muscle, every movement, was ready for the moment when they would make their stand. And then, just as the first rebels reached the barricade, Jethro shouted, "Now!" In an instant, the villagers sprang into action. The traps they had set earlier were triggered. Ropes and makeshift snares sprang up from the ground, tripping the horses, pulling them from their riders, and sending the rebels crashing to the earth. The sound of chaos erupted around them as the rebels struggled to regain control of their horses, but it was too late. The villagers, emboldened by their first victory, rushed forward, brandishing their weapons. Jethro led the charge, his sword raised high as he cut down the first rebel to approach. The man's eyes widened with surprise as Jethro's blade found its mark, the force of the strike sending him tumbling to the ground. The young man beside Jethro, now finding his courage, thrust his spear into the chest of another rebel, his hands steady as he took his first life. It was a moment of terror, of uncertainty, but also of clarity. This was what they had fought for. This was what they would defend. The rebels were disoriented, their confidence shattered by the surprise of the trap and the villagers' fierce resistance. Jethro could see the leader of the rebels on the far side of the battlefield, his face twisted in anger and disbelief as he rallied his men. But even the leader was not immune to the force of Jethro's strike. With a calculated move, Jethro cut through the chaos, his sword moving like an extension of his own body. He ducked beneath a swinging blade, then sliced upward, cutting through the rebel's side in a single, fluid motion. The man collapsed, gasping for breath, his sword slipping from his hand. Jethro didn't pause. He was already moving, his eyes scanning for the next threat. The rebels were regrouping, but they were no match for the villagers' newfound resolve. They had fought back the first wave, but Jethro knew they couldn't hold off forever. "We need to press them," Jethro shouted to the villagers. "Don't give them time to regroup." They moved together, a unified force. The men and women who had once tilled the soil, who had once lived in peace, now fought side by side, defending what was theirs. Their movements were uncoordinated at times, clumsy in the way of men and women who had never been in battle before. But their hearts were set. They would not give up. The rebel leader, seeing his forces falter, finally gave the order to retreat. "Fall back," he shouted, his voice harsh, tinged with disbelief. But it was too late. The rebels had already lost the momentum. The villagers, driven by the realization that they could win, pushed forward, their spirits high. They had defended their homes, their families, and their land. Jethro stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching the last of the rebels flee into the distance. His body ached from the fight, the wounds of battle already beginning to set in, but the victory was theirs. The farm, the land, had been defended. The villagers gathered around him, their faces tired but filled with pride. The fear that had once held them back had been replaced with a quiet strength. They had fought, and they had won. Jethro looked at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and weariness. "You've done it," he said, his voice soft but steady. "We've held them off. But don't think this is over. They'll come again. And next time, we'll be ready." The young man who had first come to Jethro stepped forward, his face filled with awe. "We did it. We actually did it." Jethro nodded, a small, grim smile on his face. "We fought for our homes, for our future, and we'll keep fighting." The rebels had been beaten back for now, but the war was far from over. The kingdom was still in turmoil, the rebellion still raging in the hearts of many. But for one brief, fleeting moment, the farm stood as a testament to the power of unity, of standing together in the face of fear. And Jethro, once the kingdom's greatest swordsman, stood as their leader, a farmer, a warrior, and a protector of the land he had come to love. The wind carried the dust from the battlefield as Jethro stood at the edge of the farm, his sword still in his hand, though now it felt heavier than it had during the fight. The villagers were gathering around, murmuring among themselves, their faces filled with a mix of disbelief and pride. The farm had been defended, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Jethro allowed himself a moment of quiet. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light across the field. It was still early morning, but there was no peace in the air, not yet. The first victory felt more like a reprieve, a brief pause in a larger battle that would only grow more intense. The rebellion was not finished. This was not the end, but for tonight, they had held their ground. Jethro turned to the villagers, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had chosen to stand with him. They were bruised, battered, but they were standing tall. The fear that had gripped them only hours before was now replaced with something stronger, resolve. "We've won today," Jethro said, his voice steady, "but don't mistake this for the end. They'll be back, and when they do, we'll be ready." The young man who had first come to him for help stepped forward, his face still pale from the fight, but now filled with a quiet fire. "We'll fight," he said, his voice firm. "We'll fight for our land, for our homes." Jethro nodded, his heart swelling with pride for the young man and for all of them. "Yes, you will, and you'll do it well, but we need to prepare. We can't win the next battle with just our will." One of the older men, a farmer with a deep-set face and hands rough from years of labor, spoke up. "What do we do now, Jethro? How do we make sure we don't end up like the others, broken and burned?" Jethro's gaze softened as he looked at the man. "We don't stop," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We reinforce the defenses. We train, and we prepare. This isn't just about protecting what we have. It's about fighting for the future. The kingdom may be falling, but this land, our home, doesn't have to." The villagers nodded, their faces hardening as they realized the truth in Jethro's words. They had seen the horrors that the rebellion had brought. They had seen what would happen if they did nothing, if they let fear drive them into submission. But they had also seen something else, their own strength. They had fought for their homes, for the land they had worked, and they had won. They were not powerless. Not anymore. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. The wounded were tended to, the bodies of the fallen were moved, and the farm was secured once more. Jethro didn't rest. He couldn't. He moved among the villagers, giving direction, offering guidance where it was needed, but always with an eye on the horizon. The enemy could return at any moment, and they needed to be ready. As the sun rose higher, the mood among the villagers began to shift. They were no longer just survivors, they were fighters. They had seen the cost of standing against the rebellion, but they had also tasted the sweet, bitter victory of holding their ground. They were ready to fight again. Jethro stood at the edge of the farm, watching the horizon, his sword resting against his shoulder. He didn't know how long they could hold out, how long they could fend off the rebellion. But one thing was certain, he would not let them fall without a fight. This land, these people, would not be taken so easily. The young man approached Jethro, his face now determined, his stance strong. "What do we do next?" Jethro looked at him, his eyes sharp. "Next, we make sure we never have to fight like this again. We prepare. We send word to the neighboring towns. If the rebellion's coming for us, it's coming for them too. We need allies." The young man nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. "And what if they don't help us?" Jethro turned to face him, his gaze steady. "Then we fight alone, and we win." The air was thick with determination, the weight of the battle still heavy in their hearts. But now, there was something else, the knowledge that they could win. And Jethro would make sure they did. The days following the battle were long, filled with the work of rebuilding and fortifying their defenses. Jethro knew that the small victory they had achieved was fragile. There were still many threats out there, and time was running out. Every minute that passed was one where the rebels could regroup, where more of his people could be lost. But the villagers, emboldened by the fact that they had successfully repelled the first wave, were no longer just looking to survive. They were beginning to see the possibility of a future where they could push back the tide of chaos. Jethro had learned long ago that survival was never guaranteed. Every battle he fought, every kingdom he had served, had shown him the cost of complacency. He could not afford to rest on their small victory. They had to strike while they still had the advantage, before the rebellion had time to rebuild its strength. Standing on the rise above the farm, Jethro stared out at the horizon. The distant hills were peaceful enough, but he knew better. The rebellion could be anywhere. The shadow of the conflict stretched further than he could see. His thoughts turned back to what the young man had asked him earlier, the question that had lingered in Jethro's mind ever since. What if no one came to help them? The neighboring towns were as vulnerable as his own, scattered across the kingdom, each one struggling with its own fears. Would they stand with him? Would they fight for their land? Or would they leave them to fend for themselves? It was time to find out. Jethro turned back to the farm and called for a meeting. The villagers gathered around him in the barn, their faces hard and determined. They had seen the consequences of the rebellion's unchecked rage. They had felt it when their homes were threatened, their lives nearly lost. But they had also seen their strength. They had fought together and lived to see another day. "I'm sending out scouts," Jethro began, his voice firm as he addressed the crowd. "We need to know who's with us. I'll be sending messengers to the neighboring towns. We need to know if they're ready to stand with us, or if we'll have to face the next wave alone." The villagers exchanged nervous glances, but they didn't flinch. They understood what Jethro was saying. It was one thing to hold the farm, to defend their own land, but it was another to stand alone against the full force of the rebellion. They needed allies, people they could trust. A grizzled farmer named Rogan stepped forward, his face lined with years of hardship. "And what if they don't come, Jethro?" he asked, his voice low and gritty. "What do we do then?" Jethro met Rogan's gaze, his jaw tightening. He had no easy answer. He had spent too many years fighting for other kings, other lands, to know what it felt like to fight alone for his own. But that was the reality now. He could no longer wait for others to decide his fate. "Then we do what we've always done," Jethro said, his voice steady. "We stand, we fight, and we make sure they know we'll never go down without one hell of a fight." Rogan nodded, his face hardening. The others seemed to draw strength from Jethro's words, their resolve hardening like steel in the forge. It was not just about the rebellion anymore. It was about survival. It was about protecting what they had built, protecting their homes, their families. "Send the messengers," Rogan said. "Let them know what's coming." Jethro gave a single nod. The farm needed to be fortified, and he couldn't waste any time. He would send his best men to the nearest towns, those that had survived the worst of the rebellion, seeking help. But even if the towns refused to lend their support, Jethro knew what he had to do. They would not simply survive. They would fight. The messengers departed the next morning, leaving the farm in the hands of those who would stand guard. The villagers worked tirelessly, reinforcing the barricades and preparing for the worst. They were determined, but Jethro knew that their resolve would only take them so far. They needed more. As the hours stretched into days, the tension on the farm grew thicker. Jethro spent his time training the villagers, teaching them the basics of combat, how to defend themselves, how to strike with precision. They were quick to learn, eager to become something more than the terrified farmers they had once been. Jethro pushed them hard, but with each passing day, they grew stronger, more confident. Still, his thoughts lingered on the messengers. Had they made it to the neighboring towns? Would they return with good news? Or would the rebellion close in before they had time to prepare? It was on the fourth day, after sending out the messengers, that Jethro saw the first rider appear on the horizon. His heart skipped a beat, and he stood still, watching as the rider approached. As the figure drew nearer, Jethro could see the dust kicked up by the horse's hooves, the weariness in the rider's posture. The messenger had returned, and behind him, Jethro could see the outlines of others, their horses trotting along with purpose. Jethro walked toward the rider, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. His heart pounded in his chest, uncertainty and anticipation mixing within him. The rider reached him, his face grim, his eyes clouded with the weight of the news he carried. "Jethro," the rider said, dismounting. "I've come from Larkspur. The town is ready to fight, but there's more. The others, the northern towns, they've agreed to join forces. They'll help us hold the line, but we must move quickly. The rebellion won't wait." Jethro's breath caught in his chest, a surge of relief flooding through him. The alliance was forming. The towns were rallying, united against the rebellion. They would not face this war alone. "We leave at first light," Jethro said, his voice firm, his confidence returning. "We fight together. And this time, we don't just defend. We take the fight to them." The rider nodded, relief crossing his face. It's about time someone stood up to them. Jethro turned back to the farm, his thoughts already turning to the next steps. The battle had just begun, and the rebellion would soon know that they had made a grave mistake by underestimating him and the people of the land. The kingdom would rise again, starting with the farm. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.